Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a gloomy, rainy, kind of crummy day here in suburban Chicago. I'm out for a stroll and looking at the weather and going, the weather is gross today. That said, it's a good day for several reasons. One, Frosthaven came in. My son and I punched it last night, and I let him organize it, which turned out to not be a problem. I mean, I would have enjoyed organizing, certainly, but he enjoyed it too. And now it's organized, and I didn't have to do it. The couple storage bins that come in the new Gloom in Frosthaven are really nice. Well done, South LaFair Games. Now, my copy of Frosthaven was missing a couple of the add-ons, which is frustrating, so I've emailed them, and we'll see. Eventually, I'll get them. It's nothing I can't do without. It's the solo scenarios and the Envelope X reward I didn't get. And I should have gotten them because I ordered 2 copies of Frosthaven. I went in with a friend to save on shipping, and we ordered 2 copies of the solo scenarios and 2 copies of the Envelope X rewards, and we got only 1 copy of each. So my friend will get his copies right away because I'm the one who bought it, so I'm the one who's interacting with them. I'll wait for my copies patiently because I know they're still shipping a lot out. But we are firmly into February now, and I thought I would do a segment, which I'm trying to do about once a month, called the 400 Back. I don't know why 400, but it felt like the right amount, maybe because once I reached 400 episodes, it felt like looking at what was going on in the podcast 4 years ago is interesting. So today I looked back, since this is going to be episode 507, I looked back at episode 107 to see what was I talking about 4 years ago. Episode 107 was about rules goofs, and I did not look to see if there have been any subsequent episodes in between about rules goofs. If so, I will post links to those on the show notes. But listening back to episode 107, a couple things stood out to me. One, I said it was November when I was recording that, which means that I think the first year I recorded the podcast, I did more than 100 episodes, or else I didn't start in January. I'm not sure how I ended up recording episode 107 in November, but that's what it said. Most of the episode was devoted to just telling the story of 2 interesting rules goofs that we played that happened in our gameplays. The first was a rules goof that we made in a recent play of A Touch of Evil, where I forgot to give the enemy enough health. In fact, I gave them about a third of the health they were supposed to have, or a quarter. And then the other one was Gloomhaven, where in setting it up, my daughter had not noticed the strength of the enemy, the strength part, and set the enemies all at level 0, even though we were fairly high level at that point, and we clobbered them with very little effort. In both cases, I talked about the way that graphic design as a choice in how games are made can dramatically shape the way that you understand and learn the rules of a game. And I stand by that lesson. So I talked a little bit about trying to learn that lesson as a designer and think about how my graphic design can help people understand the rules. So 4 years down the line, what else do I have to say about rules and rules blunders? The first one I want to say is, I think one of the places that rules blunders emerge is when games do not lean into the instinct players have for how things should work. Now, sometimes that's entirely reasonable that games don't work the way people should work. You know, if a game is built around the idea that it works differently than other games, yes, great. But I think sometimes games do things differently just to do things differently, right? The classic example is in games where they'll name something in the game that has a name already. You know, like a classic example is, let's say the cards that you get are contracts. And so the game says, take a contract from the contract deck. All right, so then you're transposing the word card into, as opposed to draw a card from the contract deck. The reason that's different is that if it says take a contract from the contract deck, now you have to do a tiny bit of mental work to remember that, oh yes, the cards in the contract deck are in fact the contracts. You have to remember that it's called the contract deck. If there's more than one deck, then there's an economy of verbiage in saying take a contract rather than taking what's something else you might get a card for, a soldier. There's an economy of verbiage that happens if you just use the noun, take a contract, take a soldier. But if those nouns aren't very clearly connected to objects on the game board in a way that's very intuitive, then what you have is people have to then go through the step of remembering, oh yes, contracts are the cards in this deck, soldiers are the cards in this deck. So that you can have varying success about trying to make your rule book slim by introducing terminology. If the people have to work hard to remember that terminology, it's often a problem. So just saying, take a contract card from the deck, take a soldier card from the deck, that extra use of the word card could be the difference between somebody easily learning a thing and not learning a thing. But that's not really what I was thinking of when I was thinking of instinct. I'm trying to think if I could think of a good example of a game where instinct comes into play. I mean, the only one I can think of actually goes to more about the next example I have. The second new observation I had about rules blunders was the way that people, as more and more people play a game, you can count on people to find edge elements of the rules that you hadn't thought of before. The way I'm experiencing this most often is, as the primary person on Board Game Geek representing XYZ Game Labs, I often answer rules questions about our travels. In particular, the piece that seems to get the most rules questions is the cat meeple. Now, in the original Kickstarter for our travels, the Kickstarter went very well, and so one of the stretch goals they added was a little wooden cat. And the wooden cat doesn't do anything in the game until somebody gets the tangled cat card, at which point the wooden cat gets placed in that person's bowl, and now they can't craft anything because the cat is all tangled up in their bowl. Haha, good old one. But it's really interesting to see how often we have to answer questions about that. There are multiple threads where people are like, what is this cat meeple for? Because they're unpacking the game and they haven't figured out, and the rule book doesn't say anything about the cat meeple, at least not the original edition. I don't know if the most recent edition, if we added a note about the cat meeple or not. I'd like to think we did, but I don't remember. But we also have seen several edge cases where people are really questioning how the cat meeple works, because there's a distinction in people's minds between putting your action token on your board and selecting a action space on your board that includes the crafting action and doing a crafting action. And so for a lot of people, there's a distinction between the two, and the cat meeple prevents you from doing a crafting action regardless of where it's coming from on your turn. But you can still select that action space, especially if it's one of the combined ones, or you could say you could do some shopping and some crafting. Well, you can do the shopping part, you just skip the crafting part. So it's interesting the way that rules that seem clear don't always appear to be clear. And we found a couple places where I had to have the designer weigh in because the rules are ambiguous. Which leads me to my next point, and this is the idea of edge cases. I think one of the places where people make the most rules blunders is when they discover that an edge case does not work the way that the rest of the game did. Now, there are some games where edge cases are pretty rare, and you just have to have a clear way to resolve that particular edge case. But there are other games where it sort of goes out of its way to make edge cases. A great example would be the Vital Lacerda games. In particular, here I'm thinking of Weather Machine, but substituting any of them for this. In a lot of Lacerda games, there are 3, 4, 5 steps you have to take in order to do a thing. You have to gather certain kinds of resources, you have to gather certain kinds of workers, you combine them at a certain time on your turn, doing a certain kind of action. And often there are nuances that come into play that you just kind of have to remember. Now, I will say the best move that Eagle Griffin ever made was combining the very clever graphic design of Ian O'Toole with Lacerda, because a lot of Lacerda's games, once you unlock how Lacerda's rules are being represented by Ian O'Toole on the board, you can often just figure out how a thing works by reading the pieces on the board. And I found this to be true with a lot of Lacerda design, or Ian O'Toole graphic design. Like recently I played Rococo, which I'll talk about in a future episode of the podcast. And in that game, most of the spaces that came up, I was able to figure out what they do and how they work, because the Ian O'Toole graphic design was very consistent and easy to understand. It helps that I've played hundreds of games, so I'm sort of used to how the graphic design should work. And that leads back to the idea of instinct. Like, if you put a thing on a game board and you don't label it clearly, people might have instincts about how it should work, even if it doesn't in fact work that way. But regarding edge cases or unneeded complexity. I mean, one of the places that I found that particularly grating was there are these 3 progress tracks in Weather Machine, and each one gets you bonuses or scores you points in a different way. So as you progress up the track, you have to remember that these tracks activate differently. And the graphic design shows you that, but you have to interpret those every time you move a thing, which is really frustrating. And I would put that in opposition to the 3 or 4 tracks on the Vladimir Suchy game, Messina 1347. In that game, the tracks that people are using, the tracks people have access to, are much more along the lines of the traditional tracks on tracks games like the Italian games from Gigli and those folks. Stuff like Lorenzo il Magnifico and Coimbra. In both of those games, there's tracks that you're progressing up, and as you go along, you gain benefit. And so what Suchy did is he and his design partner for Messina made several tracks in that game that you progress up as you're going along, and then you get benefits when you get to them. And the benefits vary widely. So progressing up the different tracks gives you different kinds of things, but you don't have to learn to read the tracks differently. Whereas Lacerda, you have to learn to read the tracks differently. And they didn't have to be that way. They could have all moved the same way, and you just alter the way the rewards are drawn or included on the track so that you could still get the same effect, but not make people learn to read each track different. And remember, the bigger issue is remember that each track reacts a little bit differently. So another rule thing that I've come to really like, especially in the more complicated games I play, are player aids that have a good step-by-step procedure. I would point to Vladimir Suchy again in Messina 1347, or pretty much any of his games. They've always had these little step-by-step cards that you use so that as you're going through your turn, you just walk through the steps on the turn, and that tells you what to do. Of course, you have to remember how each of those things work, but especially in games that have some level of player-controlled bookkeeping, it's really nice to have a step-by-step reminder of how that bookkeeping works. Although the preferred method for designing in a way that people won't forget the rules is to use the components in a way that the components themselves create the bookkeeping. You know, a great example of this is the innovation that Terra Mystica had, where when you would take a building off of a player board, that building, what was underneath that, then became a reward you get. And that part is really compelling from the perspective of trying to remember things, because just when you go to income, you go and look, and every place there's a little hand, that's a thing you get. So I think the best of the games that has these step-by-step games is through the step-by-step guides is Through the Ages, which, to be fair, is not a game I play on the table very much at all. I play this digitally, dozens of times a year, but I can't remember the last time I played it on the table, in part because it takes much, much longer, which is also probably true of the online play, although maybe not. But also because, it's because it's so long. But a big part of the game is after each turn, then you have to go through the steps to make sure that you do all of your upkeep properly. And the upkeep, the steps, and the order of the steps are really important in the upkeep. The same is true of Messina 1347, which has a really interesting flow of upkeep on your turn, or flow of actions on your turn, which can get in your way in ways that are satisfying and annoying at the same time. So yeah, I think as you're designing a game that you want people to not forget the rules for, having a step-by-step guide as part of the process is really important, especially if your game has sort of step-by-step processes. If it's something like Nanti Narking, where there are no steps in between, you play your card, you do the actions on the card, you draw back up to your maximum hand size, or minimum hand size. Boom. That works really well. Versus games where there's a bunch of stuff to do in between, they really need a step-by-step guide. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I don't know, again, I don't have good examples of this, just like I didn't have good examples of intuitive rules. I don't have great examples of counterintuitive rules, and this would be, the opposite, right? Where you make a rule that doesn't make clear how things work or doesn't fit the way that people expect things to work, and that can cause a lot of trouble. For example, the game Wingspan, I would point to the way that they have legislated the dice in that game feels counterintuitive to me. So the base rule says that anytime you're able to take food from the bird feeder, if you only have one choice, meaning all the dice in the bird feeder have the same face showing, then you may, if you want to, re-roll the dice before you make your selection. I like that rule. I think it's great. It keeps the dice from feeling too punishing. It's excellent. That's not my problem. My problem is the interpretation that the Stonemeyer Brigade have given to that rule in one specific context that has cascaded through other contexts, which is, the way they said it is, every time the game compels you to check to see what food you might want to take, if there's only one choice, then you re-roll. Here's my problem with that. There are a number of cards from the first set where it says something like, if you're able to take a worm from the tray, you may do so. And for me, checking to see if you're able to take a thing is not the same as taking a thing. And I can't say why, but it really bugs me that the official ruling is, when you go to check to answer the question, is there a worm there for you to take? If there's only one face to choose from, then you re-roll the dice. And then, if there's a worm, you can take it. I guess the reason I don't like that is often those powers are related to the cascading powers that are happening after you've taken a turn. And so they result in the dice being reset a lot more often than they would if the ruling were the other way, which is you check the tray. If there's no worms there, you don't get to take anything. Because, to me, the rule that says if you're going to take a die and there's only one choice, but you're not taking a die, you're checking to see if you could take a die. And right now you can't, but now I'm leaning back the other way, because checking to see if you could, well, if you were actually taking a die, you get to re-roll. I don't know. I feel that rule feels counterintuitive to me. I feel like check the tray is not the same as take a die. And it's take a die when you actually get to choose one of the dice faces. So to me, that's counterintuitive. But a lot of those rules that get a lot of discussion online are in fact counterintuitive, or for some ways of thinking they're counterintuitive, which is what I challenge you to think about and report over on Board Game Geek Guild 3269. What rules blunders have you encountered? I didn't share very many this round. I couldn't think of any because I'm so good at rules. No, I just couldn't think of any. Most of the time when I make rules blunders now, I forget to explain a rule while I'm teaching. We'll get halfway through the play and I'll realize I forgot to mention something about endgame scoring or something about how you do a thing. The classic example would be forgetting to mention in Seven Wonders that people can't build two of the same building. That's a classic mistake that you shouldn't make when you're teaching it. Okay, so my question, what are some rules blunders you've made recently? What are some extra guides or things you think people should remember as they're exploring rules? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share your thoughts about rules and games. I'd love to read them. Thanks for joining me on my walk today in this watery, rainy space. I appreciate you joining me. I look forward to the next walk, or I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.